I was away for 3 weeks. When I came back, my daughter had emptied my bank account, sold my car, and changed the locks on the house under my name. She thought she had left me with nothing. She didn't know I had documented every move she made over the past 6 months, waiting for this exact day. The key didn't turn. I stood on the front porch of my house. My house. The one I had paid a mortgage on for 29 years. The one where I had raised a daughter, grown a garden, and once accidentally set the kitchen on fire trying to make Bob's birthday cake. And I turned the key again, the way you do when you think maybe you just did it wrong the first time. The deadbolt didn't move. I stepped back and looked at the door the way a stranger would. There was a new welcome mat. It said "Home Sweet Home" in a font I would never have chosen. The shutters had been painted a color I can only describe as someone's aunt decided to get adventurous. And there was a small camera mounted above the door frame that I absolutely did not install. My phone buzzed. Marissa. I let it ring. My name is Helen Drummond. I am 64 years old. I spent 36 years as a CPA in Chicago, which means I have spent the better part of my adult life looking at numbers until they confess their secrets to me. I understand spreadsheets. I understand documentation. I understand how money moves when someone is trying to make sure you don't notice it moving. I also understand my daughter. Marissa is 37. She is charming the way a real estate attorney is charming, which is to say she could convince you that a flooded basement is a water feature and have you thanking her for it. She got my mother's cheekbones and her father's ability to talk for 40 minutes without ever actually saying anything. Bob always found this hilarious. Bob is no longer here to find things hilarious, which is honestly one of my greater ongoing complaints about the situation. Bob died 3 years ago. Heart attack, which is the kind that doesn't give you any time to prepare. He was in the garage looking for his fishing gear, and then he wasn't anymore. We had been married for 38 years. He told terrible jokes, burned everything he cooked, and was the best person I have ever known. The house got very quiet after that. I am not going to spend too long on that part. This story is not about grief. It is about what grief can do to a person's blind spots, and what certain people choose to do when they see you have some. Marissa was attentive after Bob died. I want to be fair about that. She called often. She came for Sunday dinners with Greg and Lily. She helped me sort through Bob's things when I was ready. For about a year, I thought we were doing well. Then she started asking about the house. Not directly. Marissa never comes at anything directly. She circles. She drops things into conversation sideways, between bites of pasta, between talk about Lily's soccer practice and Greg's work trip, and then returns to the subject a little closer than before. Mom, this place is a lot for one person. I told her I managed fine. Those stairs, though, and the yard. You're not getting any younger. I told her that if I fell down the stairs, I would call 911 like any other person. I just worry, she said. Greg worries too. I looked at Greg. Greg appeared to be worrying primarily about whether there was more garlic bread. We were thinking, Marissa continued, that it might make sense to start thinking about your options. I told her my option was to continue living in my house. She smiled. Of course. I just want to make sure you're planning ahead. That was the beginning. Over the following months, the conversation came back in different forms. Sometimes it was wrapped in practicality, the property taxes, the upkeep costs, the fact that the house had appreciated, and I was sitting on an asset. Sometimes it was wrapped in health. Once, after I had a routine procedure on my hip, she arrived at the hospital with Lily, who immediately began reorganizing everything on my tray table. And Marissa sat across from me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed concern, and told me that moments like this were a reminder that we all needed to think about the future. I looked at my granddaughter, who had by that point organized my Jell-O cups by color. I was very tired of thinking about the future in the way Marissa wanted me to think about it. The house by then was worth somewhere around $1.2 million. Chicago real estate had done well over the 29 years since Bob and I bought it, and the neighborhood had become the kind of desirable where coffee shops have Italian names and nobody bats an eye at $9 for a croissant. I knew exactly what I had. I had been a CPA for 36 years. What I didn't fully appreciate was how far Marissa had already moved past asking. I found out on a Tuesday in February. I was reviewing my files. Nothing unusual, just routine, when I noticed that a document I had signed the previous fall looked different from what I remembered signing. Marissa had brought it over one evening, describing it as standard paperwork her firm recommended for estate planning. She'd walked me through it quickly at the kitchen table, answered a couple of questions, and I'd signed it. I trusted her. She was my daughter. But looking at it again carefully, the way I look at documents professionally, rather than the way I'd looked at it over a glass of wine with my daughter smiling across the table, I realized the scope of what I had signed was considerably broader than described. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I want to describe what that feels like. The moment you realize that someone you love has been methodically working around you. It isn't anger, not right away. It is something quieter and colder. It is the recalibration of every conversation for the past year, every phone call, every Sunday dinner, every I just worry, mom. Running them all back through a new filter and watching them come out different on the other side. I did not call Marissa. I called Pat Novak. Patricia Novak has handled my legal affairs for 21 years. She is methodical, unsentimental, and has never once in 2 decades told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was more useful. I drove to her office the next morning with the document and everything else I could find. She read it all. Then she leaned back and looked at me the way she looks at things when she is deciding how bad to make the news sound. "Helen," she said, "if you confront her now, she knows you're watching. Documents disappear. Stories change." I asked what she recommended. "We proceed as though you don't know anything," she said, "and we spend the next several months making sure that when you act, there is nothing left to argue about." I nodded. "Also," Pat added, completely deadpan, "you're going to need to go on a trip." Pat said trip the way a general says retreat, not as a defeat, but as a tactical repositioning that the enemy would catastrophically misread. The plan was simple. I would spend 3 weeks away, somewhere far enough that Marissa would believe I was distracted, somewhere with a friend who knew the full situation and could be trusted not to accidentally ruin everything by posting about it on Facebook. The trip needed to look spontaneous. It needed to look like a 64-year-old widow finally treating herself. I called Carol Whitmore. Carol and I have been friends since 1987, when we sat next to each other during an accounting certification course in downtown Chicago, and bonded over our mutual conviction that the instructor had never once in his life looked at an actual spreadsheet. She lives in New York City now, in an apartment on the Upper West Side that is approximately the size of my kitchen, which she describes as cozy, and I describe as a very ambitious closet. She knew Bob, she knows Marissa, and when I called her and explained the situation, there was a long pause, and then she said, "Helen, I have been waiting for you to wise up about that girl since 2019. Get on a plane." So I did. But before I left, Pat and I spent 4 months doing the kind of quiet, careful work that doesn't look like anything from the outside. We revoked the authorization I had signed, replacing it with a document that looked nearly identical, but contained exactly none of the authority Marissa believed she had. We did this without announcing it, without changing anything that might signal to Marissa that the ground had shifted beneath her. We also transferred the house into a trust. This is the part that still makes me smile when I think about it. While Marissa was circling the property like she was waiting for a parking spot to open up, Pat and I quietly moved the entire legal structure of ownership. The title Marissa believed she was working with ceased to exist in the form she understood. She was, without knowing it, preparing to file paperwork on a house that no longer existed the way she thought it did. It is a genuinely extraordinary feeling to set a trap and then go to New York. I also installed a security system. Cameras at every entrance, professional grade, footage stored on a server in Seattle that Marissa would have had no reason to know about. When she noticed the cameras on a Sunday visit, I told her there had been a break-in 2 streets over. "That's so smart, Mom," she said. It really was. During those 4 months, I paid attention. Marissa continued her visits, her calls, her careful circling. She mentioned once in passing a colleague of Greg's who specialized in private property arrangements for families in transitional situations. I filed that away between the meatloaf and the dessert and said nothing. She asked me once whether I had updated my will since Bob died. I told her I was working on it with Pat. She nodded, satisfied, the way people look satisfied when they think they already know the ending. Carol met me at JFK with a coffee and an expression of gleeful anticipation that I found both appropriate and mildly alarming. We spent 3 weeks being tourists with intent. We walked across the Brooklyn Bridge. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and spent 45 minutes in the Egyptian wing because Carol has had a thing about ancient Egypt since 1994, and I have learned to simply accept this about her. We ate too much at a restaurant in Little Italy that had checkered tablecloths and a waiter named Dominic who called us both Bella and clearly meant it as a business strategy. It worked. We tipped well. I also, every morning, checked in with Pat. She gave me updates the way a surgeon gives updates during an operation. Calm, precise, without drama. The title transfer is registered. The revocation is clean. Dennis confirmed the paperwork Marissa's contact filed last spring. We're ready when you are. Dennis Ruiz, Pat's financial investigator, had been working quietly in the background for 3 months by that point. He had traced the movement of funds I hadn't authorized, identified the associate Marissa had been working with, and built a timeline that was, in Pat's words, airtight and slightly horrifying. I was sitting on a bench in Central Park eating a pretzel the size of a steering wheel when Pat called on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. They moved today, she said. The trees in Central Park were doing that thing they do in fall where they look almost unreasonably beautiful, like they're showing off. I looked at them for a moment. Tell me, I said. Marissa and her associate, a property consultant named Warren Briggs, who had apparently never considered that digital footprints are a thing, had gone to the house. A locksmith had been called. My locks had been changed. My car, which had been in the driveway, had been removed. I would later learn it had been sold to a dealership in Naperville for 60% of its market value, which honestly offended me more than anything else. My accounts at 2 of my 3 banks showed unauthorized transfers totaling just over $90,000. Marissa had also, through the associate, attempted to file a property transfer. The filing had been rejected, because the title they were working from no longer existed in the form they believed it did. The trust had been registered 6 weeks earlier. Their paperwork referenced a legal entity that had, from the perspective of the county recorder's office, simply ceased to be available. They had changed my locks, sold my car, emptied portions of my accounts, and filed transfer documents on a house they could not legally transfer. I finished my pretzel. I called Carol over from the coffee cart where she had been pretending not to listen. Well, she said. They did it, I said. Carol sat down beside me on the bench. She looked at the trees, then she looked at me. Helen, she said, I want you to know that I have never been prouder to know you. I thanked her. Then I pulled out my phone and texted Pat. 4 words, file everything. I'm coming home. I booked a flight for Thursday morning. Carol insisted on driving me to the airport at 5 a.m., which is an act of friendship I will not forget. On the way there, she made me stop at a 24-hour diner in Queens for eggs and coffee because she said I needed to eat something before I went to war. She was not wrong about that. I ate my eggs. I drank my coffee. I looked out the window at the Queen streetlights reflected in the wet pavement, and I thought about my house, my locks, my car, my accounts, and my daughter, who had looked me in the eye across 100 Sunday dinners and decided that I was someone who could be managed. I thought about Bob, who would have had something terrible and perfect to say about all of this. I thought about Lily, who was 8 years old and had nothing to do with any of it and deserved better than the situation her mother had created. And then I paid the check, got in Carol's car, and went to the airport. The flight from JFK to O'Hare is 2 hours and 20 minutes. I know this because I have made that flight approximately 40 times in my life. It is not a flight that invites reflection. It is a flight that invites a ginger ale and a crossword puzzle, and the quiet management of whatever feelings you have decided to have later. I had a lot of feelings scheduled for later. The woman next to me on the plane was traveling with the emotional support animal that turned out to be a rabbit named Gerald. Gerald spent most of the flight staring at me with the particular intensity of a creature who knows things. I found this oddly appropriate. I landed at O'Hare at 11:47 in the morning. I took a rideshare to my house because I no longer had a car, a fact that was currently generating criminal charges but which was also, practically speaking, inconvenient. The driver was a very cheerful man named Marcus who asked how my trip was and whether I had seen any shows in New York, and I said yes, wonderful, and a very good show was about to open in Chicago actually, One night only, very limited seating. He said that sounded exciting. I said I thought so too. Here's the thing about arriving at a house where someone has changed your locks. It is not the lock itself that gets you. A lock is a mechanism. A lock can be dealt with. What gets you is the accumulation of details around it. The new welcome mat you didn't choose. The shutters painted in a color, and I cannot stress this enough, that can only be described as dusty mauve decided to have an identity crisis. The camera above the door that I had not installed, positioned at an angle that would have recorded my arrival if it had been connected to anything, which it was not, because Marissa had purchased a camera that required a subscription service she had not yet activated. I know this because Pat had dentist check. I stood on the porch for a moment. I tried my key, mostly for the confirmation of it, the way you press a bruise to make sure it still hurts. It didn't turn. I nodded to myself, the way you nod when the universe behaves exactly as predicted. Then I walked around to the back door. Marissa had not changed the back lock. I want to be generous here and say that this was an oversight born of haste. I want to be generous. What I will say is that I have known my daughter for 37 years, and she has always been the kind of person who focuses entirely on the dramatic gesture and occasionally forgets the logistical follow-through. She got this from her father. Bob once planned an elaborate surprise anniversary dinner, rented a restaurant, ordered flowers, wrote a speech, and forgot to tell me not to eat beforehand. I arrived having consumed an entire rotisserie chicken. We still laugh about it. I used to laugh about it. I let myself in through the back door, put the kettle on, and looked around my kitchen. Several things were different. There was a staging bowl of decorative lemons on the counter that I did not own. A small printed sign near the window read, "Gather," in a font that suggested someone had purchased it at a boutique near Wicker Park. Two of my cabinet handles had been replaced with brass ones that did not match the rest. Marissa had been redecorating. Marissa had been redecorating my house, which she did not own, in preparation for selling it, which she could not do, to buyers who would have discovered eventually that the title was legally undeliverable. I looked at the decorative lemons for a long time. Then I took one out of the bowl because they were in my house, and I put it next to my tea. I called Greg first. This was Pat's suggestion. "Call the husband," she had said. "He either knows everything, in which case you find out immediately, or he knows nothing, in which case you find out that too. Either way, you learn something before Marissa has a chance to manage the narrative. Pat thinks in terms of narrative management. This is why I have kept her for 21 years. Greg answered on the third ring. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for a phone call he was hoping would never come. "Helen," he said. "Greg," I said. "I'm in my kitchen. The kettle's on. I thought you should know." A very long silence. "Helen," he said again, with completely different energy. The first one had been a greeting. This one was a man watching a controlled demolition begin. I told him I was aware of the accounts. I was aware of the car. I was aware of the locks. I told him that Pat had filed everything that morning and that Marissa should contact a criminal attorney before the business day was out. "She told me," Greg said quietly, "that you had agreed to all of it, that it was your idea." I looked at the decorative lemons. "Greg," I said, "does that sound like me?" Another silence, longer this time. "No," he said. "Honestly, Helen, it really doesn't." I told him that his cooperation with the investigation would be noted. I told him that whatever he knew and when he knew it was going to matter. And I told him that whatever happened next, my granddaughter was not responsible for any of it, and I intended to make sure she was protected from the worst of the fallout. He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for longer than he'd realized. "Thank you," he said. I told him not to thank me yet. Marissa arrived 43 minutes after I called Greg. I know the exact time because I was watching the camera footage on my laptop, my camera, my server in Seattle, my 60 days of cloud storage, and I watched her car pull up. Watched her sit in it for almost 4 minutes before getting out. Watched her walk to the front door and let herself in with the new key. She came into the kitchen and stopped. I was sitting at the table, tea in front of me, the folder of documents Pat had prepared beside my cup, the decorative lemon next to the folder because I felt it added something. Marissa looked at the lemon. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. Mom, she said. Sit down, I said. She sat. I let the silence go on a little longer than necessary because I have earned the right to let silences go on as long as I want in my own kitchen. Then I reached out, picked up the lemon, and placed it in the center of the table between us. I want you to tell me, I said, whose lemons these are. Marissa stared at me. Because I'll tell you what I think, I said. I think they're mine. Marissa has many qualities. Patience is not one of them. She lasted approximately 11 seconds of lemon-related silence before she started talking, which is actually longer than I expected, and which I am choosing to count as personal growth on her part. Mom, I can explain. I picked up my tea. I said nothing. The accounts. That was just a temporary measure. I was going to tell you. I was protecting the money while the house situation got sorted out. I sipped my tea. I said nothing. The car? Okay, the car was... Warren thought it made sense to liquidate smaller assets first before... Warren, I said. Marissa stopped. Warren Briggs, I said. Property consultant. Drives a lease. Has a website that uses the word bespoke 4 times on the homepage. The color that moved across Marissa's face cycled through approximately 5 distinct shades, none of them good. I have seen that face before. I saw it in 1999 when she was 16 and told me she was sleeping at a friend's house in Evanston, and I found out she had actually been at a concert in Milwaukee. The face had matured somewhat since then. The fundamental architecture remained the same. How do you know about Warren? Marissa, I said. I was a CPA for 36 years. I have spent my entire professional life finding things that people tried to hide. What exactly did you think was going to happen? She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked, for the first time in possibly her entire adult life, genuinely uncertain about which version of the story to lead with. I have to tell you something. In the weeks leading up to this moment, when I was walking across the Brooklyn Bridge and eating pretzels in Central Park and lying awake in Carol's apartment, listening to New York City do its incomprehensible New York City sounds through the window, I had imagined this conversation many times. In some versions I cried. In some versions she cried. In one version, which I am not proud of, I had prepared a PowerPoint. Pat had advised against the PowerPoint. What I had not anticipated was how tired I would feel. Not angry, not vindicated. Tired in the specific way you get tired when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to be true anyway. And the energy you spent hoping was all just quietly wasted. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. My daughter, who had sat at this table doing homework, who had eaten approximately 900 bowls of cereal at this table, who had cried at this table when she and Greg had a miscarriage the year before Lily was born. And I had sat exactly where she was sitting now and held her hands and told her it was going to be all right. I thought about Bob, who would have walked in at this exact moment, assessed the situation entirely from the lemon on the table, and said something so perfectly wrong that all 3 of us would have ended up laughing. That was his gift. He could diffuse anything. Bob was not here to diffuse anything. I needed the money, Marissa said finally. Her voice had changed. The attorney voice was gone. What was left was smaller and less composed, and despite everything, despite the accounts and the car and the dusty mauve shutters and the decorative lemons that were not hers, I felt something shift in my chest. Tell me, I said. She told me. It took a while. The short version is that she and Greg had been in serious financial trouble for the better part of 2 years. A real estate investment that Greg had gotten them into, not my idea, Mom, I want that noted, had collapsed badly. They had borrowed against things they shouldn't have borrowed against. They had borrowed from people who expected to be paid back on timelines that were becoming uncomfortable. The house, Marissa had decided, was the solution. Worth over $1 million, owned by a 64-year-old widow who was, in her estimation, rattling around in it alone and probably ready to be persuaded. She had planned to have the transfer completed before I returned from New York. She would tell me afterward. She would make sure I was comfortable somewhere. She had, in fact, already looked at 2 independent living communities in Naperville and one in Schaumburg and printed out the brochures. Naperville, I said. Mom, you were going to put me in Naperville. It's a very nice... Marissa. I held up my hand. I grew up in Chicago. I raised you in Chicago. Your father and I have lived in this house for 29 years. And your plan was Naperville. She had the decency to look slightly ashamed about the Naperville part specifically, which honestly I appreciated. Here is what Marissa did not know, at the point when she was sitting across from me explaining the Naperville situation. She did not know that the authorization she had used to access the accounts had been revoked 4 months earlier, and that every transaction she had made with it was therefore unauthorized on its face. She did not know that the car sale had been documented by Dennis within 48 hours, including the dealership in Naperville again, incredibly, the sale price, and the paper trail back to Warren Briggs. She did not know that Warren Briggs, upon being contacted by Pat's office that morning, had immediately and enthusiastically decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced exposure, which is what people do when they find out that the person they helped defraud was a 36-year CPA who had been documenting everything for 6 months. She did not know that Pat had already filed with the state's attorney's office, the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, and had a call scheduled for that afternoon with a detective at the Chicago Police Department, who Pat described as efficient and pleasantly humorless. She did not know about the server in Seattle. What Marissa knew, at the moment she was sitting in my kitchen explaining the investment collapse and the Naperville brochures, was that she was in trouble. She did not yet know the full dimensions of the trouble. The full dimensions were, by that point, somewhat architectural in scale. I let her finish. Then I told her, calmly and in order, what had been filed, what had been documented, what Warren had already said, and what the title situation actually was. I watched her face move through several more of those shades as the scope became clear. When I got to the part about the trust, about the fact that the house she had attempted to transfer had not existed in transferable form for 6 weeks, something happened to her expression that I can only describe as the look of a person who has confidently ordered in French at a restaurant and just been told there is no such dish. The trust, she said. The trust, I confirmed. Since when? Since 6 weeks before you changed my locks, I said, while you were picking out welcome mats. She looked at the welcome mat visible through the front hallway. I picked that out, she said quietly. I know, I said. It's terrible. Lily called my cell phone at 4:17 that afternoon. Lily is 8 years old and therefore has no involvement in, awareness of, or responsibility for any of the preceding events, and I want to be absolutely clear about that. She called because she had lost her favorite hair clip and believed I might know where it was, which I did not, but I told her I would look. And she said, "Okay, Grandma," and then told me about a joke she had learned at school. Why can't you give Elsa a balloon? I said I didn't know. Because she'll let it go, Lily said. Get it? Like the song? I said I got it. Dad says you're coming for dinner Friday, she said. I looked at Marissa, who was sitting across from me staring at the table. I'll be there, I said. I hung up and looked at my daughter for a long moment. She doesn't know anything, Marissa said. I know, I said. I didn't want... She stopped. I didn't want this to affect her. Then you should have thought about that, I said. Before Naperville. Pat Novak has an office on the 14th floor of a building on West Madison Street that has a view of the Chicago River and a waiting room with chairs so aggressively uncomfortable that I have always suspected she chose them deliberately to put clients in the right psychological state before meetings. I sat in one of those chairs the following Monday morning and thought about the past 6 months. Pat appeared at her office door at exactly 9 a.m., which is when she always appears, because Pat operates on a schedule that atomic clocks consult for accuracy. She looked at me. She looked at the folder under my arm. She nodded once, the way generals nod in films when the battle has gone according to plan. How are you holding up? She said. It wasn't really a question. With Pat, it never is. I'm fine, I said. Good, she said. Come in. Here is what happened in the weeks after I sat across from Marissa and her decorative lemons. Warren Briggs, who had apparently never once considered that cooperating immediately was an option available to him until it was the only option available to him, gave investigators a full account. The plan had been Warren's professional architecture and Marissa's initiative, which is a polite way of saying that Marissa had come to Warren with a problem, and Warren had come back with a solution that involved my accounts, my car, my locks, and a timeline designed around my trip to New York. Warren had done this before. Not with family members specifically, but with elderly property owners in what he described in his statement as transitional situations. The Chicago Police Department detective, who Pat had accurately described as pleasantly humorless, found this characterization interesting enough to open 2 additional inquiries that had nothing to do with me. Warren was having a difficult autumn. Greg, it turned out, had known approximately 40% of the plan. He had known about the financial trouble. He was, after all, responsible for half of it. He had known that Marissa was handling things. He had not known the specific mechanics of the handling, or so he told investigators, and there was enough ambiguity in his involvement that Pat said the exposure was limited, but not non-existent. "He's not a criminal," Pat said. "He's a man who asked very few questions because the answers were inconvenient." I thought about Greg at my kitchen table eating garlic bread while Marissa talked about my options. I thought about the 40% he'd known and the 60% he'd chosen not to ask about. "That's not nothing," I said. "No," Pat agreed. "But it's also not the same thing." The charges came down on a Thursday. 2 counts of financial fraud. 1 count of unauthorized use of financial authorization. 1 count related to the property filing. Warren received his own set, slightly more extensive, which he was addressing through his attorney with the energy of a man who had abruptly discovered religion. I was in the Art Institute of Chicago when Pat called with the news. I had gone there the way I sometimes go there when I need to think without actually thinking, just walking through rooms, looking at things that have nothing to do with anything. I was standing in front of a painting I have stood in front of many times over the years, a large one with a lot of blue in it, when my phone buzzed. "It's done," Pat said. I looked at the painting. "All of it?" "All of it." I stood there for another minute. A tourist next to me was taking a photograph of the painting with a tablet computer the size of a cafeteria tray, which Bob would have had opinions about. I had opinions about it too, but I kept them internal. "Thank you, Pat," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "You built the case. I filed the paperwork. This is the most emotionally generous thing Pat Novak has ever said to me in 21 years, and I intend to remember it forever." Marissa called me that evening. I answered, which I want to note, because I could have let it ring. I have a well-documented history of letting things ring. She sounded different. The attorney voice was completely gone now, had been gone since the kitchen table, and what was left was something I hadn't heard in a long time. Something younger and less composed and considerably more honest. "Mom," she said, "I need you to know that I kept telling myself it was going to be okay. That you'd understand eventually. That I was going to fix it and pay it back and you'd never even—" "Marissa," I said. "I know," she said. "I know." "I need you to stop explaining the story you were telling yourself," I said, "and I need you to understand the story that actually happened." A silence. "You looked me in the eye," I said. "At my kitchen table. At your father's kitchen table. Every Sunday for a year. And you were working around me the entire time. I know. I'm not asking you to respond to that," I said. "I'm asking you to sit with it." She was quiet for a long time. Outside my window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November, which is remind you forcefully and without apology that it is in charge. "Is there anything?" she started. "Your cooperation with the investigation," I said. "That's going to matter. Pat says full cooperation significantly affects the outcome." "I know. I already called." "Good. And Greg?" "Greg is handling his portion," I said. "That's between him and his attorney." Another silence. Longer. "Lily asked me why Grandma's car is different," Marissa said quietly. I closed my eyes briefly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her Grandma got an upgrade." I looked out at the November sky over Chicago, dark and flat, and entirely uninterested in anyone's feelings. "That's actually not bad," I said, something that might have been a laugh, very small and slightly broken. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry." Now here is the thing about sorry. Sorry is a word. It is a useful word. It is a word that means something when it comes with a change in behavior, and means considerably less when it comes alone. I have been a CPA long enough to know that an apology without accountability is just a story someone tells to feel better about the ending. But I also know my daughter's voice. I have known it for 37 years, from her first word, which was more, appropriately, through every phase and mood and version of herself she has cycled through. And the voice on the phone that evening was not the voice of someone managing a narrative. It was the voice of someone who had run the numbers finely and discovered what they actually added up to. "I hear you," I said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was something smaller and more honest. The acknowledgement that the word had landed, that I had received it, that we were both still here on opposite ends of the phone in November in Chicago, with a very long road ahead of us and no map for any of it. "Friday dinner," I said. "Lily is expecting me." "I know," Marissa said. "She's been asking since Tuesday. Then I'll be there." I hung up. I sat in my living room in my house, my locks, my key, my 29 years of this particular address in this particular city. I looked at the spot on the counter where the decorative lemons had been. I had thrown the lemons away. I had kept the bowl, though. It was actually a nice bowl. I put fruit in it. Real fruit, the kind you eat, not the kind you display as a lifestyle statement. Bob would have found this very funny. I found it a little funny, too. The legal process took 11 months. I will not walk through all of it because some of it is tedious and some of it is still complicated, and the parts that are neither of those things are mostly just sad in the particular way that family legal proceedings are sad. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just slow and expensive and illuminating in ways you didn't ask to be illuminated. What I will tell you is the outcome, because the outcome is what matters. Marissa pleaded guilty to 2 counts. The sentence included substantial fines, community service, and a period of probation. She did not go to prison. I want to be clear about that because I think people reading a story like this sometimes expect prison, and I am not certain that was what I wanted. What I wanted was accountability. What I wanted was a record, permanent, documented, inarguable, that this had happened, that it had been tried, that it had failed, and that there were consequences. Warren Briggs received a more comprehensive set of consequences, which the detective Pat described as pleasantly humorless, pursued with what I can only call professional satisfaction. Warren is no longer in the property consultation business. He is currently exploring other opportunities, by which I mean he is legally prohibited from several of his previous ones. Greg cooperated fully. His exposure was ultimately limited. He and Marissa are still married, which surprised me, and which I have chosen to categorize as their business and not mine. Pat sent me a bottle of wine when it was over, a very good one. I called to thank her, and she said don't mention it in the tone she uses when she actually means you're welcome, but finds direct warmth professionally destabilizing. I have known her long enough to translate. I got a new car. This felt important somehow. Not the car itself. It is a perfectly sensible sedan. Dark blue. The kind of car that asks nothing of you emotionally, but the act of choosing it. Walking into the dealership in Lincoln Park and test driving 2 options and deciding myself, based on my own preferences, with my own money, to acquire a vehicle that belonged entirely and unambiguously to me. The salesman was very enthusiastic. I told him I was a retired CPA, and he immediately became slightly less enthusiastic about the extended warranty, which was the correct response. I drove home along Lakeshore Drive with the windows down, even though it was October and entirely too cold for open windows. And Chicago did that thing it does sometimes where the lake is so flat and gray and enormous that it looks less like water and more like the edge of something. Bob and I used to drive this stretch on Sunday mornings sometimes, before Marissa was born, before any of it, when we were just 2 people in a city with nowhere specific to be. I thought about him for a while. Then I turned the heat on because I am 64 years old, and there are limits. I had the locks changed back in July. My locksmith was a young woman from Wicker Park named Sonia, who arrived with a toolbox covered in stickers and an opinion about the previous hardware that I found both unsolicited and accurate. She said the deadbolt Marissa's locksmith had installed was adequate but uninspired. She said this with genuine feeling, the way people talk about things they actually care about, and I found it enormously refreshing after 11 months of talking to people about things nobody wanted to care about. She replaced everything with hardware she described as honest, which is not a word I had previously applied to door fixtures, but which I immediately understood. My key turns in my lock. The deadbolt moves. The handle opens. I gave Sonia a very good tip. Lily turns 9 in February. She has recently developed an intense interest in weather patterns, which she explains to me in considerable detail every Friday dinner, with the focused energy of someone who has found their calling at age 8 and intends to pursue it without mercy. Last week, she told me about a weather phenomenon called a derecho, which is apparently a line of intense storms that moves very fast and hits very hard before most people know it's coming. I told her that sounded familiar. She said, "It's really interesting, Grandma," with the tone of someone who suspects she is not being taken seriously, and I told her I was taking it very seriously, which I was. She showed me a diagram she had drawn of wind patterns over Lake Michigan. It was genuinely quite good. I put it on the refrigerator. Bob would have had it framed. Marissa and I have had 4 real conversations since the guilty plea. Not phone calls about logistics or Lily's schedule or the practical negotiations of a family that has been through something and is still figuring out its new shape. 4 actual conversations, sitting down, about what happened and what it meant and what, if anything, comes next. They have been difficult. They have also been, in the specific way that difficult, honest things sometimes are, useful. I am not going to tell you that we are fine, because we are not fine in the way we were before, and I think pretending otherwise would be a disservice to both of us. What I will tell you is that we are something. We are in the early and uncertain process of figuring out what. That is not nothing. That is actually, I have come to believe, the most honest place to be. Here is what I would tell someone who found themselves where I found myself 18 months ago. Trust what you see. Not what you hope, not what you remember, not what you have decided to believe because believing otherwise is too expensive. What you actually see in front of you. Numbers do not lie. Paper trails do not lie. The gap between what someone says and what the documents show does not lie. Document everything. Not because you plan to use it, but because having it means that when the moment comes, you are not scrambling. You are ready. Get a good lawyer before you need one. Pat knew my files, my intentions, my entire financial history. When it mattered, we moved the same day. That is what 21 years of relationship buys you. Do not let anyone reframe your home as a burden. Your home is not a burden. It is not an asset that isn't working for you. It is the physical record of your life. The coffee mug Bob bought at a gas station in Indianapolis on a road trip in 1987 that I have never once considered throwing away is worth more than any offer on the table. Do not let anyone with a spreadsheet and a brochure from Naperville tell you otherwise. And finally, it is possible to love someone and still hold them fully accountable. I have learned this in the most direct possible way. These are not contradictory things. Love without accountability is just tolerance with better PR. Accountability without love is just punishment. What you are aiming for is the thing in between. The harder, quieter, less satisfying thing that says, "I see exactly what you did. I am telling the truth about it. And I am still here." That is not cruelty. That is respect. For them, for yourself, and for everything you spent your life building. It is November in Chicago. The tree in my backyard, a crabapple that Bob planted the year Lily was born, insisting it would be beautiful and was mostly wrong for the first 4 years until suddenly it wasn't, has gone the color of something on fire. I can see it from the kitchen window when I make my morning coffee. I make my coffee. I look at the tree. I think about Bob, who planted it badly and loved it anyway. I think about Lily, who is 9 in February and is going to tell me about derechos. I think about the key that turns in the lock now. My key, my lock, my crabapple tree that is, frankly, showing off. I drink my coffee. It is a very good morning.